Hello, and thank you for joining us for today's message. I'm Eric, the lead pastor of South Mountain Community Church. Thank you for taking just a bit of your time to be with us today. We exist for one reason, and that's to help as many people as possible take their next step towards becoming fully devoted and fully delighted followers of Jesus Christ. And I know that for so many people, church and even religion can be messy and oh so complicated, but it doesn't have to be that way. Here you can belong before you believe. So our hope is that your first visit with us is enjoyable, meaningful, and unlike the church experiences of your past. We also think that the best way to experience delight is with others in person. So SMCC is about more than just a Sunday sermon. We have 5 locations for you to choose from where you can connect with people in authentic community. We want every message you hear to engage your head, your heart, and your hands for a life of full delight. So with all of that in mind, enjoy today's message.
That the slogans and stories of a culture say a lot about it. The slogans and stories that arise within a particular culture say a lot about that culture. For example, Nike says, just do it. Airbnb invites us to belong anywhere, and Disneyland calls itself the happiest place on earth, which is debatable. I would argue that is a debatable point. And I think we could break those down and analyze those and learn a lot about the cultures in which those companies exist through that method. But this morning, if we're going to do that, I want to break them down a little bit more so with some other slogans that belong to another type of company altogether. Because I think some of the most entertaining slogans that I ever come across are those that belong to beer companies. And so that's what I want to do this morning, just kind of pick through a couple of those. So first off, Corona invites us to find your beach. That's what they say, which is a nice invitation, right? They're inviting us to rest on a beach, drawing on the value and even the desire that we have for rest in this life. It's just that Corona is telling us that the best way to achieve that rest, with or without a beach, is through buying and enjoying Corona, probably with a lime, right? That's the best way to get it. So that's one of them. Another one is this, Miller Lite, great taste, less filling. This right here is one of the most successful ad campaigns to ever run. And it was combining a couple of different things. On the one hand, they were trying to say that you can maintain your physique, your figure, right, without drinking all of these empty calories. It's less filling, and you don't have to sacrifice on taste to get there because it has great taste and it's less filling. The best of both worlds, right? That is the argument they're making, or the claim. And then the third one is this, Red Stripe, classic slogan, hooray beer, about as simple as it gets, right? And with this, it's leaning into the value of celebration, right? Of having a good time with people that we love. And we value that as a church. That's why we just spent a month talking about and celebrating together. And Red Stripe is drawing on that very same value. They just want to make sure that they are part of the celebration also. And I think with all of these, they're leaning into values and desires that we have that are good things. And they're using it to try and attach those values to their products so that we will buy them more. And at the end of the day, I don't think there's anything really harmful about that. But there is one beer slogan that I do find to be particularly troubling. And it's the one that belongs to Michelob Ultra, which says, it's only worth it if you enjoy it. Is that true? Is the question for today. It's only worth it if you enjoy it. And I'll be honest, there's part of me that wants to affirm part of this because I think it's true to say that most people are on a search for happiness rather than truth, that they're far more, that myself included, we are often far more motivated for happiness, to find and locate and enjoy that within this life than we are to find and locate truth. And as a church, we even lean into this because we believe the Bible to be teaching that Jesus invites us into the life that is most marked by joy. And yet, it is so because it's built on truth. But I think there's one other piece of this, and that there's a sense in which we can affirm it, but there's also a sense in which I can't, right? That I continue to find this slogan difficult and problematic. And in particular, it happens when life doesn't go the plan. The question being, what happens when life doesn't go to plan? What happens when things go south? What happens when the marriage that we once enjoyed ends up on the rocks or maybe even ends in divorce? What happens when the children that we delighted in grow up and the relationship is broken and they want nothing to do with us? What happens when things go horribly wrong in this life and we come face to face with the inescapable reality of suffering in this life? Does that mean that whatever endeavor we were on, whatever relationship we had, somehow wasn't worth it? According to Michelob Ultra, that's exactly what it means, which is why I take issue with it. That's why what I'd like to do over the next 20 or so minutes together is take some time just unpacking all of this together. And I want to do that by turning to a story from another culture that has so much to offer on this particular subject. Because today we're opening up a new sermon series on the book of Ruth, a book that we find in the Old Testament that has an awful lot to say about life, about loss, about love, and even perhaps most of all about the place of God in the highs and lows of life. And that's why we're going to take the next 4 weeks just walking through this simple yet beautiful story told across 4 separate chapters, just taking one chapter at a time. And today I want to open up with chapter 1 as we look at this story that opens and takes this kind of sudden downward twist into suffering almost unimaginable. Because in seeing these events unfold, we get the chance to see how these people so long ago responded to their own suffering that unfortunately looks so much like our own. And so Ruth chapter 1, verse 1 is where I want to pick it up together and just walk through this first chapter today. So it opens like this, Ruth 1, verse 1. In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land. So a man from Bethlehem in Judah, together with his wife and 2 sons, went to live for a while in the country of Moab. They took a trip to Arches, is essentially what happened. Different Moab. So within these opening lines, there's not a whole lot about it that feels particularly ominous, right, or foreboding to you and me this morning. But if we were to translate this into our own cultural language, this would be the moment when you see people gathered around a table, enjoying a nice meal together, laughing and smiling, this picture of joy and communion. And yet, in the background, you begin to hear this music start to play. That is an indication that while everything looks well, there are horrible things about to happen. And we know that for a couple of things that we see in the opening lines. First off, this story occurs within the days in which the judges ruled. And the book just prior to the book of Ruth is called the book of Judges, that gives us an account of this period in history. And so it was a time before the kingdom had been established in Israel, so they didn't have one unified king. They just had different judges that would kind of rise up at different times, at different moments of need, and sort of deliver the people from their oppression, fight off the bad guys, and restore peace, at least for a little while. And the closest cultural equivalent that I can give to these judges is they're basically like Wild West heroes, kind of like Clint Eastwood and John Wayne, right? That they do their best to fight off the bad guys, restore peace and order, even though they themselves are not exactly perfect. And for that reason, it's never an age that you could accurately describe as peaceful. But even with that, what we see throughout the book of Judges is there is this consistent downward trajectory that the people of Israel continue to spiral deeper and deeper and deeper into darkness. So that at the very end of the book, you have these accounts even of murder, of rape, even of genocide. Right? That things end with an incredibly dark and bleak picture in the days in which the judges ruled. Meaning it is anything but a good time to be in Israel, and yet that is exactly when this story is set. And so that's the first indication, the first cue for the bad music. And the second one is that there's a family, right? This man and his wife and their 2 sons who live in Bethlehem, a name which literally means the house of bread, and yet there's a famine, so there is no bread in the house of bread. And so they make the decision to leave the land altogether, to go to Moab, to go to a neighboring countryside, a neighboring land. Instead, the decision to leave Israel is never a good decision. And so that too is an indication that bad things are to come. And as we continue reading with the story, we see exactly what those bad things are. So picking it up at verse 2, it says this, the man's name was Elimelech. His wife's name was Naomi, and the names of his two sons were Mahlon and Chilion. They were Ephrathites from Bethlehem, Judah, and they went to Moab and lived there. Now Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died, and she was left with her two sons. Right? This is the first strike of tragedy. Her husband dies. We're not told how, we're not told why, we don't get really any of the details, but we know that somehow she becomes a widow as her husband dies. After this, her two sons, they marry Moabite women. So they marry, and the wives' names are Orpah and the other Ruth, for the woman for whom the book is named. And after they had lived there about 10 years, both Mahlon and Chilion also died, and Naomi was left without her two sons and her husband. This is the tragedy. This is the suffering that Naomi is plunged into. First, her husband dies, and she becomes a widow. And then there's a little bit of a shred of hope in that her sons marry, but before these marriages are able to produce any children, both of her sons go on to die also. So that at the end of 10 years in this foreign land, her husband is gone, her sons are gone, the relationships that were absolutely closest to her, that she cared most about in this life, are gone. She is all alone with nothing except for her two daughters-in-law. And I think the question is, when tragedy strikes, where do we typically go? I think for most of us, usually, if we're not there already, we go home. That's exactly what Naomi decides to do also, in part because she hears about something that's taking place back in the land of Israel. Verse 6, when Naomi heard in Moab that the Lord had come to the aid of his people by providing food for them, meaning the famine has ended, she and her daughters-in-law prepared to return home from there. With her two daughters-in-law, she left the place where she had been living and set out on the road that would take them back to the land of Judah. Then Naomi said to her two daughters-in-law, go back, each of you, to your mother's home. May the Lord show you kindness as you have shown kindness to your dead husbands, to my sons, and to me. May the Lord grant that each of you will find rest in the home of another husband. Then she kissed them goodbye, and they wept aloud and said to her, we will go back with you to your people. But Naomi said, return home, my daughters. Why would you come with me? Am I going to have any more sons who could become your husbands? Return home, my daughters. I am too old to have another husband. And even if I thought there was still hope for me, even if I had a husband tonight and then gave birth to sons, would you wait until they grew up? Would you remain unmarried for them? No, my daughters. It is more bitter for me than for you, because the Lord's hand has turned against me. It's only worth it if you enjoy it. So at this point in the story, she's beginning the trip home. And at first, her two daughters-in-law are coming with her, but she tells them not to. As she urges them, she pleads with them to go back home, spelling out the details and the logic of the decision, that if you decide to come with me, you will have nothing. Right? That there's no hope for you. There's no life for you in this decision. And so I understand that it's sad and it's difficult, but just go home, because there's still hope for you. The unspoken side of that being that there is no hope for Naomi. And at the very close of her speech, of her words, she gives an indication of why she believes that to be the case when she says, the Lord's hand is against me. And I think within her words there, we actually get a little bit of insight into the human condition in general, and even the way that we so often respond to suffering. And it's that in our suffering, it's easy to believe God is against us. It's easy to believe that God isn't for us in the midst of our pain. And I think even if we grew up or have some kind of background in religion, maybe we are prone to thinking in this way because we were taught to. Maybe we were even instructed in this line of thinking, that when something went horribly awry, when our marriage ended, when things went south with one of our children, right? Maybe when the baby didn't come to term. Maybe the reason we were given is because we ourselves weren't good enough. And if we had only been better, if we had only been more faithful, if we had only been more worthy, God would have kept things together for us. I think even if we don't think in that particular way, there are still moments in which we wonder how God could possibly allow these things to happen. I'll be honest, I have wondered that at times. I think in a way, one of the main reasons this story was written was to help us wrestle with that very tension within our own lives. As we see Ruth and Naomi wrestling with it in theirs. And so Naomi tells her two daughters-in-law to leave, to go back home, to marry again, to enjoy good lives. This is their response. Verse 14. At this, they wept aloud again. Then Orpah kissed her mother-in-law goodbye, but Ruth clung to her. Look, said Naomi, your sister-in-law is going back to her people and her gods. Go back with her. But Ruth replied, and these are some of the most famous words of dialogue ever recorded within the Bible. She says, don't urge me to leave you or to turn back from you. Where you go, I will go, and where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord deal with me, be it ever so severely, if even death separates you and me. When Naomi realized that Ruth was determined to go with her, she stopped urging her. So again, Naomi urges them to turn, to leave, to go back, to build good lives and enjoy them. And Orpah does. And to be clear, there's nothing wrong with Orpah's decision, right? That she does this, she makes this choice, even at Naomi's pleading. This is what Naomi wants her to do, and yet Ruth makes an entirely different choice. She decides to cling to her, to commit to her mother-in-law, so that even in the midst of her despair, her loss, her misery, at least she has one person in her corner. I think with Ruth's decision, what we have here is this beautiful portrayal of love. And it even tells us something about the true and real nature of what love is. That love is a willingness to sacrifice for another's good. It's a willingness to sacrifice even at our own expense in order to bring about the good and the benefit of another person, even when that person may not be particularly excited about it themselves, which is what we see with Naomi. And so Orpah goes home, Ruth clings to Naomi, and the two of them complete the journey back to Bethlehem. And that's really where the first chapter comes to a close. And so I just want to read this to the end, and then we'll pause there for a bit. But verse 19, so the two women went on until they came to Bethlehem. When they arrived in Bethlehem, the whole town was stirred because of them, and the women exclaimed, can this be Naomi? Don't call me Naomi, she told them. Call me Mara, because the Almighty has made my life very bitter. I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back empty. So why call me Naomi? The Lord has afflicted me. The Almighty has brought misfortune upon me. So Naomi returned from Moab, accompanied by Ruth the Moabite, her daughter-in-law, arriving in Bethlehem as the barley harvest was beginning. All right. So they arrive back in Bethlehem, and the entire community is stirred up with this excitement to see the return of Naomi, to learn how she is, what's taken place, what these last 10 years have contained, until they begin to get an account of the details. And they see exactly what's transpired over these past 10 years, that there has been incredible loss, that her husband is gone, that her sons are gone, that she has nothing and no one except for this foreign daughter-in-law, for some reason, has clung to her. And she even tells them, don't even call me Naomi anymore, a name which means good or pleasant or even beautiful. She says, don't call me that, because that doesn't even make sense in light of my life. That name no longer fits me. And I went away and I was full, but I've come back empty. So now call me Mara, a name which means bitter, because she's saying bitterness is all I have left. And that's how chapter 1 ends. It's a pretty bleak portrait, and yet thankfully it is far from the end of the story. Because the author adds one last thing to the close of the chapter. This mention of the barley harvest that is an indication that there is far more at play to the timing of their return than what first meets the eye. We'll have the chance to unpack that over the next several weeks, but today, I just want to pause right here and talk about what we see in chapter 1. And I think one of the most significant things that we see in the passage is Naomi's insistence upon her name change. That she says, don't call me Naomi, don't call me good or pleasant anymore. Instead, call me Mara. Call me bitter. And I think within her words, there's an understanding we can draw about suffering, which is that suffering can either make us better or it can leave us bitter. One thing it never does is leave us the same. That the impact of suffering in our lives is that it changes us in one way or another. So to unpack this a little bit, I want to draw on the work of Dr. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, the Swiss-American psychologist who is most well known for inventing or clarifying really the 5 stages of grief in her work on death and dying. And she talks about these being the 5 stages, that there is denial, the denial that the loss has occurred. Second off, there's bargaining, right? Kind of on this cosmic level, trying to deal and bargain in such a way where we get back the loss that we have suffered. Third one is anger, which makes sense because anger is a secondary emotion, always arising out of some other emotion that is primary and first. And really, it almost acts as this emotion that is trying to protect us from whatever the catalyst was for the primary emotion itself. It's trying to protect us from the loss that has occurred. And then once anger subsides, what is left is the primary emotion itself, which is depression, which is sorrow, which finally gives way to acceptance of life in light of the loss that has occurred. And obviously, this is anything but a clear and cut path, right? That we cycle through these. We spend different amounts of time at different stages. Sometimes people don't make it all the way to acceptance. They never get there. They get stuck at some point along the way. And I think the chances are that in a room this size, there are probably several of us who are at some point in these stages, at some point in this journey. And for those of us who are at that place, I think the important question that I would urge you to consider this morning is just this. Where is God in your journey through suffering? Where is God in your journey through grief and loss? Because when we look at the story, one of the things we see about Naomi is that she is feeling this full range of emotions, that there is anger, there is sorrow, there is depression, there is bitterness, and she gives vent to all of it. Right? Even when it's against God, she gives vent to it. And I think sometimes we can have the feeling that that isn't right to feel that way, that we shouldn't speak that way, we shouldn't say those things, that shouldn't be part of what's happening inside. And yet, I think part of what the story is doing is inviting us to see that God is more than capable of handling our negative emotions. That we can take the full range of what we feel, even when it's against him, and lean into him with it in the midst of our grief and our loss and our suffering. And I've even talked with people who have been through horrendous losses in this life, and they have described that through their loss, through their suffering, they've drawn closer to God in a way that they would have never expected could be. And they said they never would have chosen to go through what they did. They never wanted to go through it. They never want to go through it again. And yet they say that what they gained in the midst of it is something they could never adequately value because it was a gift. And that's why I think the important question is, where is God in your journey through suffering? And are you leaning into him? I think one of the things that helps us to do this is to understand exactly what God's heart is, what his posture is towards us in the midst of our suffering. And even within the story itself, we actually have an indication of that. Because Ruth's commitment to Naomi in her suffering is this incredible, remarkable demonstration of sacrificial love. And it is moving and compelling to us because it's a decision and a commitment that points to an even greater commitment to sacrifice on behalf of another. And it points to the decision of Jesus to sacrifice on behalf of each and every one of us, his own life. So much so, you could say that the gospel truth is in his death on the cross, Jesus willingly sacrificed himself for our good. He committed himself to us in the very same way that Ruth committed herself to Naomi so that she wouldn't be alone in her suffering. And so that you and we can know that he is with us in the very same way in our suffering, that we're not alone in it. But at the same time, so that he could die on the cross, so that he could rise from the grave, and in doing so, one day bring an end to suffering altogether. As we see described in the very closing pages of the Bible. Revelation 21, verses 4 and 5 describes that moment when all suffering and death will be brought to an end like this. It says, he will wipe every tear from their eyes. There will be no more death or mourning or crying or pain, for the old order of things has passed away. He who is seated on the throne said, I am making everything. So, Michelob Ultra says it's only worth it if you enjoy it. And to a certain extent, I can affirm that because Jesus does invite us into the life that is most for our joy because it is built on truth. And yet I think there will always be a part of me that cannot affirm that slogan completely because I think we are faced with the inescapable reality that so many of the relationships, so many of the endeavors, so many of the most meaningful aspects of this life will include and be marred by suffering and loss. And so it doesn't mean that your marriage wasn't worth it. It doesn't mean that the friendship wasn't worth it. It doesn't mean your child wasn't worth it. That's why the bottom line is what our suffering does to us is dependent on what we do with God. Because it never leaves us the same. It can leave us isolated, miserable, bitter, or it can lead us into something we would have never known otherwise if we will only lean into God in it. Would you pray with me? Jesus, we thank you for the time together this morning. We thank you for your word. We give you praise as the one who committed to us in the very same way that Ruth committed to Naomi. You entered into our experience to be with us in our suffering, to comfort us in our loss, and to see us through the journey of suffering. And we thank you that you are with us and for us in the midst of it. We thank you that you can handle our negative emotions and invite us to be open and honest with you in the midst of it. We thank you for the gift that we sometimes find in the midst of it as we do lean into you. And for those of us in this room who are in the thick of it, I pray that you would comfort them and that you would enable them to lean into you more and more and to find peace as they do. So we thank you, we praise you. In Jesus' name, amen.
Thank you so much for joining us for today's message and trusting us with your time. If you'd like to connect with one of our pastors or staff, you can easily do that by visiting smccutah.org/connect. When you fill out that quick form, they will get back to you within a few days and be able to connect with you. As well, if you'd like to know more about taking a next step at SMCC, you can easily look at what next steps we have by visiting smccutah.org/next steps. And lastly, if you found today's message both hopeful and helpful, I would encourage you to do maybe one of two things. First, you can share this message with someone that would find it helpful. And you can also choose to partner with us financially so that more people can see messages like this. You can find more information on what that looks like by visiting smccutah.org/give. Again, thank you for joining us today, and I hope to see you at one of our locations soon.